a fantastic way to see where you are in your figure drawing learning is to take 5 poses. So ideally they'd be different poses. Some have foreshortening, they'd be from different angles, maybe different body types too, and you draw each one in 5 different ways. So you draw the first one in terms of simple forms, and then in terms of gesture, in terms of values, in terms of anatomy, and then the 5th way, you bring all of the skills together into like a final figure drawing process. Now, if you struggle with that, it doesn't mean that you failed the test and you're not an artist or something like that, but it would highlight to you which area, which fundamental skill you can work on and improve, because all of these different skills are very fundamental, very important. So I'm going to show you guys how to approach this and get into some of the specifics of each skill. And you can go away and have a go at this because it's a really, really powerful exercise. And I'd recommend doing it kind of frequently, like maybe every 6 months or something. So here I'm going to try and draw this pose first in terms of simple forms. So what I mean by that is if we come up to the head, you know, I could try and copy everything that I'm seeing, just try and copy all the little outlines and everything. But instead, I'm going to try to find the underlying simpler ideas. So for example, the cranium creates that ball shape. Talked about this in previous videos, and we can add the jaw and maybe a brow line wrapping over that ball shape. And that's how I can simplify the head. So another thing that I can look for later on is in this leg that's coming towards us, in the thigh. I might turn that into a sort of cylindrical shape that tapers down going to the knee. And that's how I will simplify this really complex, you know, bunch of muscles and bone and everything else just into a really simple 3D shape. The approach that I like to take is basically to start with an egg shape for the rib cage. So there'll be a sort of egg shape in here, and I'll link a bunch of tutorials for each of these steps because I have a tutorial for each one, like for the head, for the rib cage, and for the pelvis. And I'm going to see a sort of pants shape down here in the hips and pelvis, and then that ball shape in the head. And so those 3 forms are how I generally start things. For the limbs, I'll often use these cylinders, like I mentioned, same in the arm, cylinders coming towards us. This fist is kind of creating a nice box shape, so that might be the simple form that I use in the fist. Now when it comes to the shoulder, I like to take a pretty practical approach, which is not to force it into a simple form. I know sometimes people will use a ball shape, for example, or maybe some kind of box shape or a cone. To be honest, I feel like the shoulder is an area where simplifying the form of it isn't that helpful because it has a form that I don't think really works for these other, you know, in that way. So then why would you do it? This is supposed to be tools to help us. We don't have to force everything into simple form if it's not going to work. So the other thing I like to do is if the form is really flat to our eyes, like this thigh here, it's not coming towards us, it's not going away from us, I could try and turn it into a sort of cylinder with very, very shallow ellipses, but I just don't feel that that's particularly helpful for the drawing process. It's really helpful for this thigh, which is foreshortened, coming towards us. I mean, I would struggle to draw this without using a simple form, but for this leg, where it's so flat to our eyes, I just don't think it's practical or helpful to use a simple form, so I just draw it flat like a 2D shape, right? It's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple shape that I can draw, just like that. So it's a pretty practical and I think reasonable way of approaching the simple forms exercise. So that's my first sketch of this pose. The second sketch that I'm going to do here, this one is values. Now, the first 3 ways of drawing the figure that I'm talking about is simple forms, gesture, and values. I think those are the 3 most important, with anatomy being less important than the others, which you may be relieved to hear. So if of these, the one that you struggle with the most ends up being the anatomy, then I wouldn't worry about that as much as if you really struggle with one of these 3 really fundamental skills. So when it comes to the values, I'm going to look at the pose, I'm going to close an eye, I'm going to squint, really simplify it down into shapes of light and dark. So I'm seeing, instead of seeing the face, you know, as this whole complex set of things, you know, I just might see some dark value here in the eye sockets or down the corner of the face, these kinds of things. Along the neck, I see a shadow. I see that shadow travel along here. And I'm trying as much as possible to forget about the figure itself and see the overall shapes of light and dark. That's all I really care about. Ideally, I'll be doing this exercise with poses lit from one side. If you come to our reference library, most of the poses are just lit from one side. So one side has a bunch of light shapes and then the other side is dark shapes. And so it's very easy to simplify into lit, light areas and dark areas. Now, one thing that happens with the values version is because I'm not really thinking about it as a figure, I'm going to lose some of the gesture, right? So when it came to the simple forms, I could actually keep some of the gesture in there. So I could emphasize how the ribcage egg comes down this way and then the hips come out that way. So there's a bit of an angle change there. And then I could even exaggerate that and make it a little bit more like there's a squash here and a stretch over here. If you're not sure what I mean by squash and stretch, I've got another video about that linked as well, and also one about this value simplification. But I expect my values version, where I'm really just trying to see the shape of light and the shape of dark, to be a bit stiffer in terms of the pose, right? Because I'm not thinking about the gesture, I'm not thinking about the squash and stretch. So this is my values sketch. Okay, so now we're going to skip to the next version, which is, hopefully, the more gestural version. Now, this version of the drawing for this pose has a lot of similarities to the simple forms version. So a couple of things are different. I don't draw everything in terms of simple forms, but I emphasize that big squash and stretch that I just mentioned. I might exaggerate how much the rib cage comes down and then the lower part of the torso comes off at an angle, because that is one of the interesting things I see in the gesture of the pose. So that's one thing that I'll do. I'll try to find that big S shape down the front of this leg. But you'll notice that I do still give a little nod to the simple forms idea. So there's a line wrapping over the cylindrical form of the leg. To me, that is part of the gesture of this pose. When there's foreshortened forms, the lines wrapping over those forms I find to be quite gestural. And also, I struggle to draw the stuff like a foreshortened arm like this if I don't have those lines wrapping over the cylindrical shape of them. So you'll see in the sketch, I have a line like this. I've got a line like this. I simplify this plane into kind of a boxy plane. These are ideas from the simple forms version of this pose, and I'm bringing them into the gesture because they're so helpful just to get the drawing down. But it's a much simpler drawing. There's less emphasis on form and more on big flowing curves. Okay, so then the fourth way I can try and draw this figure is in terms of anatomy. Now, when we talked about the simple forms, things like that ribcage egg, that's a really good place to start my anatomy sketch from, because that's anatomy too, right? It's the form of the ribcage, and the same in the head. I can even start to draw the arm in terms of that cylinder. So the simple forms sketch is a great way to start the anatomy diagram or the anatomy version of this drawing. The difference is that I'll start to break up those forms a bit further. So I'll start trying to differentiate, where I'm seeing like tricep versus, where I'm seeing the brachioradialis coming out from the upper arm between the bicep and tricep, traveling around to the thumb side of the forearm, for example. Or I'll try to, draw more clearly that deltoid shape and how it attaches onto the shoulder girdle and these kinds of ideas. So all I'm going to do is basically try to break up my simple forms version into certain muscle groups. I'm not going to try and draw every single muscle. There's a lot of muscles in the forearm. There's a lot going on if I really try to do that. But I'm going to try and get the main muscle groups. So bicep, brachialis, tricep, those ridge muscles that come out from the upper arm, onto the forearm versus the extensors versus the flexors on the forearm. So I might try and break up the forearm into those 3 groupings, for example, but I'm not going to try and break up each group within the forearm because there's like a million muscles in there. And if you struggle with this one, you'll be pleased to know that I think it's the least important. It's worth working on for sure over the long term, but you can still do really good figure drawings if you have holes in your anatomical knowledge. So then the final way that I'm going to try and draw this pose is by bringing all the skills together in combining them. So I'm going to start that off with simple forms ideas and gesture. Those are the 2 skills that I really want to start the whole drawing off with. So as you can see, I'm going for those cylindrical ideas. As soon as there's a really foreshortened limb or something, I've got to start thinking in terms of overlapping cylinders, simple forms. And by the way, the overlaps in those forms are just as important as the forms themselves. So you can see that there's a cylinder in the upper arm. If there's a cylinder in the forearm, it is in front of the cylinder of the upper arm. This is something that a lot of people miss. Our brains kind of naturally want to draw each form in isolation and pull them apart. The more you can get them to overlap with each other, the better, right? So you want this fist shape to be like in front. If you have a boxy shape, for example, in the wrist, the fist would be in front of that. The forearm is in front of the upper arm and that kind of thing. But I'm also thinking about gesture. So I'm thinking about that big stretch side and squash side and maybe exaggerating the pose in that way to give it a bit more interest. But now at this stage of the sketch, you can see I'm already bringing in my values skill. So when I did just values, the form was a bit stiff, it didn't have much gesture. But because I've started with simple forms and gesture, now the drawing is hopefully a bit more dynamic. And so now I can start to add the shadow shapes onto a drawing which already has, more energy, more movement to it. So I'm combining the different skills together. And sometimes in little places, I can add some nuance or with my anatomical knowledge. But you can see hopefully through this process how simple forms, it helps with everything else. And some of those simple forms are like the ribcage egg, so they are kind of anatomical, but getting deep into anatomical detail is the thing that has been the least helpful. The thing that's been the most helpful is probably the simple forms. So as I'll just skip through the rest of this, one skill that once you've got these, you can start to work on a bit more might be your skills with edges and varying your edges in different ways. We have another video about that I'll link below. And that's a really fun thing to start to play around with. But this is how you can draw a pose in 5 different ways. So now just to go through this with one more pose, I'm going to draw it in terms of gesture first. So in this gestural version of this pose, I really kind of push all the big, strong tapering of the limbs, the squash and stretch in the torso, the asymmetry throughout the pose. So when I'm looking at, the forearm, I'm looking for big asymmetrical curves and tapering and really exaggerating that. The overall squash side and stretch side of the torso and that kind of outward curve of the shin. These big flowing, big movement ideas in the pose are what I'm bringing out. So then I'm going to draw it in terms of values, and you can see it's a lot stiffer, like I said, because I'm just thinking about shapes of light and dark. And then the next version, I'm going for my simple forms. So thinking again about that thigh, both thighs actually being cylinders coming towards me, the head as this kind of egg shape with a brow line wrapping around it, that kind of thing. Then I do a version which is in terms of the anatomy, and I've got to think about what kind of musculature am I seeing within the figure, and trying to make sense of that and differentiate it from the forms of fat and things like that. And then I bring all of that together into a final sketch which has, the shadow shapes, the values, the simple forms which I'll bring out especially to make sense of the thighs, but hopefully also some dynamism in the gesture. And then, because I've been, Working on those skills for a bit, I've also been able to start to bring in some variation in my edges and also some changes to how I design shapes and things like that. And those would be skills, shape design and edges, that I think you can really start to work on once you feel confident with these more fundamental skills we talked about in this video. So we did this exercise in our study group. There's a link for that below if you want to really get into your figure drawing, by the way. And it was such a fascinating process. So for some people, it was a great review of topics that we had already covered, because we've spent a month on each of these skills, including all the different areas of anatomy over the last year. And so people could go back to those exercises and lessons to refine their skills with each of these. But one thing that I would really emphasize here is that you can study each of these skills like up to 100%, like be really comprehensive, like have a full encyclopedic knowledge of anatomy, to, you know, get really, really deep into simple forms or whatever. But within each of these skill areas, there's usually a 20%, there's usually 20% of that topic or of that skill that has 80% of the impact, right? So when we looked at simple forms, we just used the most practical simple forms that really help with the drawing, rather than trying to force everything into the simple forms. And when you're talking about anatomy, there's some anatomy is way more impactful for your drawing than other things. So I'd really recommend, you know, this might seem overwhelming right now, like these are huge skills and I'm asking you to learn all of them and be able to draw the figure in all these different ways. But if you focus on the simplest aspects of each skill, the bits that really matter, it becomes all a lot more doable. That is the mindset that we have in our study group. We do a lot of practice of fundamental skills, but focusing on the things that really work. And that's why the study group is so effective. So if you're interested in our study group, I would check out the link below. Another thing I would say, if you'd like a really clear map, a really clear path for going from where you are now to where you want to be with your skills, to be able to produce the artwork, the drawings, the paintings that you're dreaming of, that you kind of don't really think that you could make, but actually you could if you followed the right sequence of exercises. If you'd like to learn more about that pathway, I've got a workshop specifically about that. It's going to show you the steps that you would take to get there, all the way from where you are now, what skills you would need to work on, what kind of exercises you would need to do. It's a free workshop. You can register for it with the link below. It's completely new. I haven't run it before, and it's got all my insights basically about how to get to where you want to go with art. So if you're interested in that, check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. The link is below. All right. And in the meantime, I've put some links to other videos about these fundamental skills up on the screen, and there are more links below, so you can check those out too.